Oh, okay. I just read a headline that a Republican senator said that undocumented immigrants have no due process. No due process. What does this sound like?
And the way that the Trump administration is acting and snatching people up without due process is horrific, and it's simply un-American, and they should stop doing that and give people due process.
So recently I put out 2 videos all about free speech. And in one of those videos, I mentioned that last year when the student encampment protests were happening in my city, that I was stopped by police. I showed up to a day of an encampment protests. Nothing was really happening. I met up with my friend. We were chatting. We decided to bike away. I'm biking away, and 2 full police vans pull up. And they block the road in front of me. They get out. There's like 7 or 8 cops surrounding me. And they start asking me questions. How do you know your friend? They mention my friend's government name. What are you here for? Why are you on campus? How long have you lived in the city? Do you live in the city? Do you have any sharp objects in your bag? Are you okay if we search your bag? And it was pretty weird. It was pretty weird. But I think as a Black person in America, there's something you feel in your body when you're in those moments. But I was surprised by some of the comments I got, because I think there was one comment in particular that said, oh, when you let them search your bag, you gave up your 14th Amendment or whatever amendment. But I wanted to do this video to unpack what due process is, what due process isn't, what changes in due process we're seeing and experiencing right now. Because that comment made me angry, but it also made me think about what we have to risk to defend our rights, what the notion of a state-given right is, and the gray areas that we exist in. And in that moment, I was thinking, okay, they say they're stopping me because I was riding on the sidewalk. Okay, but it's actually because I was at this protest, and they want to use this protest as justifiable cause to check for suspicious people. And so in that moment, I understood that the police viewed me as guilty, 1, because of the reason that they said that they stopped me, but 2, because anyone protesting for this thing could be weird. I understood that they were operating with that assumption when they met up with me. I also understood that I didn't have anything in my bag that I was worried about them finding. And in that moment, like a lot of Black people do, and I won't say all, I felt that me not showing fear or acting suspicious was the best thing I could have done in a situation. But the reality is that based on someone's background or their identity or their presence in a city or what kind of work they've done, that could very much be a moment where the cops show up with the intention to frame you, to set you up. There is this very real conversation that we all need to have around this peeling back of privacy, this hyper-surveillance, the normalization of our phones being able to be searched, our text messages being able to looked at, our personal opinions being used as just cause to revoke people's visas or detain them or to indefinitely arrest them. It's a sign of increased authoritarianism and fascism. What this reality has turned me to again and again is whether or not we've actually had due process. How do we explain and look at due process? What is the point of it? Due process in the US refers to the legal requirement that the government must respect all legal rights owed to a person under the law. It is protected by the 5th Amendment, which applies to the federal government, and the 14th Amendment, which applies to state governments. Due process ensures fairness in legal proceedings and prevents the government from arbitrarily depriving individuals of life, liberty, and property. There are 2 types of due process. Procedural due process, which requires the government to follow fair procedures before depriving someone of life, liberty, or property. This includes notice of legal action, the opportunity to have a trial or a hearing, an impartial judge or decision maker, and the ability to present evidence and cross-examine witnesses. And then we have substantive due process, protects fundamental rights from government interference, even if procedures are followed. It ensures laws do not violate basic constitutional rights such as privacy, marriage, and bodily autonomy.
The back, Fred Hampton was in bed with his girlfriend and mother of his unborn child. Fred was laying over on his face with his head to the back of the bed, bleeding. While Deborah was in the kitchen, she heard one officer say, "Is he dead?" And she heard 2 more shots. And someone responded, "He's dead now." So we saw this as an outright, deliberate attempt to successfully take out Fred Hampton. Mark Clark was killed. Fred Hampton was killed. All of the surviving Panthers were indicted, arrested, and charged with attempting to murder the police in a shootout. The FBI, once they came in, the guys who did it came in and investigated it, right? It's an interesting part of this darn case.
University students, grad students, Palestinian folks being detained, arrested, etc. I have so many flashes of different points in my personal and collective history. As I mentioned in videos, I think about the 2016 RNC in Cleveland where door knocks happened. I think about 2020 and how there were a whisper of door knocks in different parts of the country. I mean, look at the case of Kalief Browder. We can clearly see that due process for some people just don't fucking exist. Kalief Browder was just 16 years old when he was accused of stealing a backpack in 2010. With no evidence and no conviction, he was sent to Rikers Island, one of the most notorious jails in the country, where he spent nearly 3 years. Two of them in solitary confinement. And mind you, solitary confinement is when they have you alone in a room with probably not even a window for 20 hours or more a day. There's clear evidence that goes back decades about the intense psychological and mental effects of solitary confinement. And it's been investigated by various human rights organizations, and it has been considered by many a war crime. And in the 3 years that he was awaiting trial, he spent 2 years of them in solitary confinement. Additionally, his family couldn't afford a $3,000 bail, and the system moved so slowly that he was effectively punished without even being proven guilty. And some of the most heinous facts from this case was that Kalief Browder was arrested and essentially told, you can only get out of jail if you take a plea deal. You can only reduce the severity of what is happening right now if you take a plea deal, which is literally how most of our carceral system works. How can we claim to have due process? How can we claim to have a fair legal system if most people are entrapped or coerced into plea deals, which is the case, which has been studied by countless legal rights organizations? Because he was offered plea deals, and because he knew that he wasn't guilty, and because he wouldn't take these plea deals and plead guilty in order to get a shorter term, he continued to be incarcerated because this is the precedent that the state sets. And the most horrible part of this case is that eventually he was released in 2015 and he unalived himself. And I recently watched a video that talked more about his case, and there was a lawyer that I think read a lot about his case afterwards and looked into the different interviews he had in order to try to attain parole. And in those interviews, this journalist noted,
never attempted suicide before, never really thought about it before he was arrested. And this is when he was 16. He went into the jail system, and this is the spring of 2010. At some point, he sees another adolescent boy in his jail down the cell block with a sheet tied around his neck who's just been taken out of his cell. He did not take his life, but he attempted. And so there was almost like a culture of suicide attempts that he was exposed to, and he started to internalize and think about a lot. And he spent much of his time, as you mentioned, in solitary confinement when he was locked up. 800 days. And, on Rikers in many places, the only way, so it's a little bit complicated how the sort of world it was just completely upside down, the world of Rikers. And the only way, there's sort of perception among officers, among some of the employees, that when a person attempts to harm themselves in solitary, that they're only doing it to get out of solitary, to get into general population, to fix their housing situation. So there's sort of this deep skepticism, and that's what you see coming through in the story. Obviously Kalief is truly depressed and having sort of serious suicidal thoughts, but in that context, things aren't taken seriously, and it's just, this is sort of what happens when we turn our jails into sort of mental hospitals almost.
He learned how to unalive himself through all of the horrific experiences that he had at Rikers, through being assaulted and tortured by staff, through being assaulted and beaten by other inmates, to having jokes made at him about how he should unalive himself, to demanding and asking from COs and prison staff that he be able to see therapy, that he be given mental health resources. His mental health decline was considered a joke, and it was exacerbated by the clear violence of the state. And it's not only the question of whether or not we have due process, it's the question of what kind of psychological damage, physical damage, torture does our carceral system just inherently normalize? What is built in as a part of these forms of punishment? And how can this even be considered humane in the first place if there's no due process? And even more, the inhumanity of what Kalief Browder and so many other young folks and folks who are incarcerated experience while they're being locked up. 80% of the 10,000 prisoners who are currently at Rikers haven't been tried. They're awaiting their trial. They're in pretrial. And so what is the point of claiming that we have due process if our system works so slow, if public defenders are so overworked that they push people into plea deals, and there is no actual process of someone who is unjustly arrested to be able to defend themselves unless they have tens of thousands of dollars. I think about how so many Black people are just steps away from something like this happening. I think of my own life and how I've been steps away from this happening to me and how it's happened to people that I know. How this is just an everyday thing for this country. And for it to get worse, it means that the elite think that this is justified, that people like Kalief Browder are just expendable. They're statistics. If they hadn't done anything wrong, how would they have ended up there? If you haven't done anything wrong, why do you care if the state is watching you? Questions like that, victim blame. They remove the active intent of the state and its agents to entrap us. What it means to demand innocence in situations where law enforcement are harassing people. Because whether or not you're innocent, is the state still fucking up? Is the state still doing something wrong? This is the case of George Stinney Jr., who was a 14-year-old who was the first child to be executed by the United States government. On June 6, 1944, George Stinney Jr., a 90-pound Black 14-year-old boy, was executed in the electrical chair in Columbia, South Carolina. Earlier, on March 24th, George and his sister were playing in their yard when two young white girls briefly approached them and asked where they could find flowers, and a search party was organized to find them. George joined the search party and casually mentioned to a bystander that he had seen the girls earlier. The following morning, their dead bodies were found in a shallow ditch. George was immediately arrested for the murders and subjected to hours of interrogation without his parents or an attorney. The sheriff later claimed that George confessed to these murders, though no written or signed statement was presented. On April 24th, George Stinney faced a sham trial virtually alone. No African Americans were allowed inside the courthouse. His court-appointed attorney, a tax lawyer with political aspirations, failed to call a single witness. The prosecution presented the sheriff's testimony regarding George's alleged confession as the only evidence of his guilt. An all-white jury deliberated for 10 minutes before convicting George Stinney of murder, and the judge promptly sentenced the 14-year-old boy to death. George Stinney remains the youngest person executed in the history of the U.S. George Stinney was so little that when they put him in the electric chair, that they had to stack a pile of books in the seat in order for him to fit into it. To put him in an electric chair, to give him virtually no due process. It shows you the reality of hierarchy in this country. And if we look at our world today, that hierarchy is not that far off. And in this conundrum of no due process and hypersurveillance, I am worried. I'm worried, but I'm also simultaneously ready to see and understand what communities need to do to protect each other.
In 1969, the weather ground hadn't formed yet. The U.S. government was already laying the groundwork to destroy them. In 1956, the FBI launched COINTELPRO. If you challenged white supremacy or capitalism, you became a target. As the 60s unfolded, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, became a major force in the student left. They organized against segregation, against poverty, against the war in Vietnam. In 1969, after years of brutal state violence, from police shootings to napalm in Vietnam, SDS fractured. Out of its radical wing came the Weather Underground, a group committed to anti-imperialism with Black revolutionaries and revolutionaries all around the world. They believed that the U.S. wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. So they fought. The state responded the way empire always does, through lies, force, and fear. The FBI used COINTELPRO to surveil, infiltrate, and sabotage the weather underground, without warrants, without charges, without restraint. Agents forged letters to sow distrust, raided homes without cause or warrants, gathered dossiers based not on criminal acts but political beliefs, dangled people out of windows, beat them up, followed them. Due process wasn't suspended. It was never offered. If the law only protects you when you obey empire, what kind of justice is that?
Hypersurveillance and the scrubbing away of due process and authoritarianism is on the rise, but there is also very clear potential right now as manufactured crisis continues that we can begin to find the tools and systems and ways to protect each other. I think of the Columbia student who had her visa revoked and was able to flee to Canada, and how in even my own language in talking about this over the last week, that I use the same language that the media was using when I was talking to friends. And I said, oh, she self-deported herself. And my co-host of my podcast said, oh, I don't like when people use that because it's like, it's not self-deporting. You're fleeing state capture. You're fleeing authoritarianism. You're fleeing the state trying to arrest you for your freedom of expression. What do you do when you or other people in your community are being targeted? And what is the reality of security culture, evading repression, and what are the different levels that that can take on? This mixture of the normalization of hypersurveillance and the scrubbing away of due process shows us in very clear and material ways that fascism is on the rise, and we need to be clear about what our plan of action is. Fascism and totalitarian states create a permanent state of exception, where rights can be suspended indefinitely. This creates a permanent state of suspicion, where simply existing in certain spaces or expressing dissent or having certain opinions makes you a potential target. And finally, in fascist systems, the truth doesn't matter. What matters is the state's ability to manufacture guilt. I plan to do another full video on security culture for my Direct Action 101 series, but I just kind of want to talk through some of the levels of how we can look at security culture. Watching each other's backs, on and offline. Are we sharing information about our friends or other people online that we don't want the state to know? Are we checking in with people when they leave our social gatherings, when they leave going out? Are we making sure people make it home? Do we have our location set for our friends? How are we checking in with each other? Using encrypted messaging apps and other systems like Signal. Signal isn't a one-stop kind of encryption messaging software, but it is one of the basic entryways for people to have an app on their phone that allows you to set disappearing messages, that allows you to have end-to-end encryption, that allows you to verify all sorts of conversations and other people that you're chatting to. And there are systems of etiquette that help people use Signal effectively, although it shouldn't be the only encrypted form of communication that you have in your disposal. If you are meeting to talk about things that are about organizing or future actions, whether they're legal or not so legal, create safe meeting places. Decide a secure location, maybe agree to have a no phones meeting, make sure that wherever you're taking notes isn't able to be found by whoever the fuck wants to find it, and maybe take notes in a way that you can get rid of those notes later on. Using burner phones and anonymous email accounts. This can be really key and vital, especially for folks that are worried about the way that the border security exception allows for U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens to be pulled aside for questioning, and based on your status, they can take your phone, go through it, and refuse you entry into the country if you are not a U.S. citizen. So a lot of folks have recommended you having a burner phone, which is a secondary phone that you buy, ideally maybe not as connected to your name, have a certain kind of action, or maybe you're traveling out of the country where you would need to have a phone where more of your information isn't accessible to the state in case they pull you aside and search you. And then also literally just training yourself to be aware of your surroundings. If you're driving around your city and you've been doing a lot of organizing, you feel like things might be a little bit hot, maybe look behind you and check on a semi-regular basis that people aren't following you. Make sure that your doors are locked. Make sure that people aren't tailing you in your car. Maybe recognize what a drone might sound like if it's flying overhead, and be aware of the different modes of surveillance that can happen against people that are identified as leaders or key community figures in a grassroots setting. Recognize and document surveillance patterns. So if you do feel like things are getting hot for your community or you or your neighborhood, document each time you feel or suspect that the state is surveying you. Has strange materials showed up at your place? Is there a weird car parked on your street that switches out every set number of days or every set number of weeks? What are the ways that you can document the ways that surveillance might be happening to you? So then if you need to present it to a lawyer and figure out what your legal course of action is, you have a clear timeline of the things that have happened as opposed to trying to pull it directly from memory. A simple step that everyone watching this video can do is printing out Know Your Rights cards, putting them at the doors in your house, handing them out to your neighbors, and distributing them to your friends. I think we deserve to look out for each other and protect each other. And I hope that these videos are maybe just giving you resources, steps, ideas for how you can have conversations with your family, community, friends. In the description, I'm going to put a few resources related to security culture, resources that I'm currently compiling and in preparation for my Direct Action 101 video on security culture. And if you have any specific questions around security culture or things that you would want to be explored or answered, leave it in the comments, because I'm definitely not an expert. I study a good amount of it. But even in my comrade community, there are people that know more. So I definitely want to approach this video from an educational standpoint, from providing as many resources as and helping people know some of the basics so you can begin to protect yourself. As I'm making all this, people are being surveyed. What is this YouTube channel? Like, have y'all thought about that? I'm talking about all these things. Who's watching this other than like-minded people? Security culture, y'all. Security culture is the reason I don't talk about everything I've done on this platform. How do you make a security culture video while being security cultured? Yeah, that's gonna be my challenge. So keep that in mind. Keep it in mind. When y'all are watching this, don't say anything in the comments you don't want the state to know. Don't say anything in the comments you don't want to. Some of the things that people are writing in the comments, I'm like, whoa. Okay, we're done. We're done. Is this still recording? Okay, it's still recording.